Okay, so picture this. You're writing, you're on a roll,
Mhm.
2,000 words a day, feeling pretty good. And then you hear about Rachel Aaron.
Right.
And she's like, yeah, 2K. That's
Yeah.
cute. I do like 10,000 words a day.
Right.
It's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So that's what we're diving into today. This is Aaron's book, 2K to 10K Words, How to Write Faster, Write Better. Write more of what you love.
And it's not even just about hitting some magical word count, right? It's about really tapping into this idea of maximizing your creative output.
Right.
And I think what's really refreshing about Erin's approach is that she doesn't shy away from the struggles.
Right.
Like she talks about, even as a professional writer with multiple books out, hitting a wall with her own series, feeling like a failure.
And that's so relatable, I think, for so many writers because it's easy to look at someone like Rachel Aaron and think, oh, she's got it all figured out.
Mm-hmm.
She's cranking out these books, she's super successful,
Right.
but she still struggles with the same things that we all do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what makes her advice so valuable
Yeah.
because she's speaking from a place of experience.
Right.
She's not just some guru who's never actually struggled with writer's block or self-doubt.
Right. And she figures out, like, okay, this is a system that works.
Yeah.
She calls it the writing triangle.
Yes.
And so it's almost like you're building a foundation for your writing.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about these three sides of the triangle.
Okay. So picture a triangle, right? And on each of these points, you have knowledge, time, and enthusiasm.
Oh.
And Erin argues that these are the three key ingredients for successful writing.
So knowledge being the first one, like what do we need to know to be good writers?
Well, one of the things she talks about a lot is the importance of really understanding your characters.
Okay.
And she emphasizes that it's not just about knowing their superficial details like their hair color or their job, but really delving into their motivations, their fears, their desires.
It's like their backstory, why they make the decisions that they make.
Exactly.
If you don't know that, then how are you possibly going to write a believable character?
Exactly. And I think that's something that a lot of writers struggle with, especially when they're starting out.
Right.
Because you're so excited to just get the story down on paper.
Right.
You don't always take the time to really flesh out your characters.
So once you've got that knowledge base, then I'm guessing time management comes into play.
Yes, absolutely. Because one of the biggest myths about writing is that you need huge chunks of uninterrupted time to be productive.
Right.
And while it's certainly helpful to have dedicated writing time,
Right.
it's not always realistic for everyone, especially if you have a day job or a family or other commitments.
Okay, so then you've got knowledge, you've made time to write, now you've got to have the enthusiasm to actually do it.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of writers get tripped up.
Because it's easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day grind of it.
Yeah, and it's easy to lose sight of why you started writing in the first place.
Right.
Which is hopefully because you enjoy it, because
Yeah.
you have stories you want to tell.
Right. It's supposed to be fun.
It is, and Erin reminds us of that throughout the book. She talks about how she used to force herself to write even when she wasn't feeling it.
Oh, yeah.
And it showed in her work.
Right.
It wasn't until she started prioritizing her own enthusiasm that she started writing her best stuff.
So that kind of leads into one of my favorite concepts from the book, which is this idea of drivers versus passengers when it comes to characters.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Tell me about it.
So imagine your characters are literally in a car, right?
Okay.
The driver is the one who's in control. They're making the decisions. They're driving the action forward.
Right.
The passenger, on the other hand, is just along for the ride.
They're reacting to what the driver's doing.
Exactly. And Erin argues that too often our characters end up as passengers
Oh, interesting.
instead of drivers.
So how do we fix that?
Well, it all goes back to that foundation of knowledge. If you really know your characters, their motivations, their goals,
Right.
then it becomes much easier to put them in situations where they have to make choices.
So give me an example from Erin's book. Like, how does she illustrate this concept?
So in her Eli Monpress series, she talks about how Eli is a driver.
Okay.
He's not just reacting to the events of the plot. He's actively shaping them with his choices, even when those choices are risky or unpredictable.
Okay, so it's about giving your characters agency.
Exactly. And that's what makes them feel so real and relatable to readers.
Right, because in real life, we're not just passively reacting to things that are happening to us.
Exactly. We're making choices.
Right.
We're taking action.
Right.
And our characters should be doing the same.
And that makes for a much more compelling story.
Absolutely. Because when characters have agency, the stakes are higher, the conflicts are more meaningful, and the emotional impact is much greater.
It's like that difference between watching a game and playing the game yourself.
Exactly. When you're actively engaged in the story, you're invested in the outcome.
Right. because you care about these characters. You want to see what happens to them.
Exactly. And that's the power of a well-developed driver character.
And that brings us to the sometimes dreaded topic of editing.
Oh, yeah.
Because you can have the most amazing driver characters in the world, but if the story itself is a wreck,
Right.
it's not going to matter.
Exactly. Editing is where the magic really happens.
Okay, so for those of us who maybe don't share your enthusiasm for editing,
Sure.
what are some of Erin's tips for making this process a little less painful?
Well, one of the first things she talks about is shifting your mindset away from this idea of editing as punishment.
Oh, yeah.
Like you finish the draft, now you have to suffer through the editing process.
Right, like, oh, now the real work begins.
Exactly. But she encourages writers to think of editing as an opportunity.
Okay.
It's a chance to polish your story to make it the best it can be.
So instead of focusing on what's wrong with the manuscript, it's about like, okay, how can I make this even better?
Precisely. And she has some really practical tips for doing that.
Like what kind of practical tips?
Well, she's a big believer in breaking down the editing process into manageable chunks.
Okay.
So instead of trying to tackle everything at once, she recommends focusing on one specific element at a time.
So like what? Start with plot, then character, then dialogue.
Exactly. Or maybe, dialogue is your weak point. Right.
So you focus on that first and get it to a place where you're happy with it.
So you're not bogged down in fixing commas when you've got a major plot hole.
Exactly. Prioritize the big picture stuff first.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then once you've got the foundation solid, then you can start finessing the details.
And this is all part of what she calls working non-linearly,
Yeah.
right? So what does that mean in terms of editing?
So instead of going from page 1 to the end in a straight line,
right.
you're jumping around, you're focusing on whatever element you're working on in that moment.
So if you're working on dialogue, you might go through the entire manuscript just focusing on the dialogue.
Exactly. And then you can move on to something else like pacing or description. Okay, that's actually really helpful because I think a lot of times we get so caught up in trying to make each page perfect before moving on to the next.
Right, and that can be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it can actually hinder your progress.
Right, because you're so focused on this one tiny detail.
Exactly, and you lose sight of the bigger picture.
So you're saying it's okay to be a little messy in the first draft?
Absolutely. In fact, she encourages it.
Okay, good, because mine are always a mess.
Embrace the mess.
Okay, I could do that.
It's all part of the process.
So once we've embraced the mess and we've kind of done our own initial edit, then what about feedback?
Yes, feedback is crucial.
But also terrifying.
Absolutely. And this is where it's so easy to get trapped in that perfectionism track,
Oh, God.
where you're constantly tweaking and revising because you're afraid to show anyone your work until it's absolutely perfect.
100% guilty of that.
But here's the thing, it will never be perfect.
Okay.
And that's okay.
So how do we get over that fear?
Well, Erin talks about the importance of setting deadlines, both for yourself and for your feedback.
Okay, so give yourself a deadline to finish the draft and then a deadline to get feedback.
Exactly. Because otherwise you can get stuck in that endless cycle of revision
Right.
and never actually put your work out there.
So true. It's like that saying done is better than perfect.
Exactly. And sometimes getting feedback, even if it's not all positive,
Right.
can be the best thing for your writing.
Because it helps you see your work from a different perspective.
Precisely. And it can spark new ideas or help you identify areas that need improvement.
So don't be afraid to share your work, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the writing triangle, we talked about editing and feedback. Are there any other kind of golden nuggets of writing wisdom that Rachel Aaron shares in the book?
There are so many, but one that really stuck with me is her take on all that traditional writing advice.
Okay, like what?
All those rules that writers are supposed to follow?
Oh yeah, like write every day and kill your darling.
Exactly. She basically says take all of that with a grain of salt.
Because some of it's good advice, but some of it can be stifling.
Right, and she encourages writers to find what works for them
Okay.
and to not be afraid to break the rules if it serves their story.
So what kind of traditional writing advice does she specifically push back against?
Well, like that whole write every day thing.
Yeah.
She's like, if that works for you, great.
Right.
But if it's just making you feel stressed and guilty,
Right.
then maybe don't do that.
Maybe find a different rhythm.
Exactly. Find what's sustainable for you.
Right.
Because the most important thing is that you're actually writing,
Right.
not that you're beating yourself up for not writing every single day.
And I love that she also talks about silencing that inner critic,
Oh, yeah.
because I think that's something that every writer struggles with.
Absolutely. That little voice that tells you you're not good enough,
Right.
that your writing sucks,
Yeah.
that you should just give up now.
It's so loud sometimes.
Oh, it can be deafening.
Yeah.
And Aaron talks about how we need to learn to recognize that voice for what it is,
Yeah.
which is basically just fear.
Fear of failure.
Exactly. Fear of rejection. Fear of success, even.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Right.
So how do we silence that voice, or at least, like, turn the volume down a little bit?
Well, she talks about the importance of self-compassion,
Okay.
which is something that a lot of writers struggle with.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're really good at being hard on ourselves,
Right.
but we're not always so good at celebrating our successes.
So, like, how do we actually be more compassionate towards ourselves as writers?
Well, one thing is to focus on the positive.
Okay.
So instead of dwelling on all the things you don't like about your writing,
Right.
take some time to appreciate how far you've come.
Okay.
Celebrate the small victories.
I like that.
And remember that even the most successful writers have bad days.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They have moments of self-doubt. They have times when they just want to give up.
Right. So you're not alone?
Exactly, you're not alone.
And that's such an important message for writers to hear.
It is, because I think a lot of times we feel like we're the only ones who struggle.
Right.
But the truth is, everyone struggles.
Yeah.
It's just that nobody talks about it.
So Rachel Aaron talking about it makes it okay.
Exactly. She normalizes it,
Yeah.
and she gives us permission to be kind to
I
ourselves,
love that.
which is huge.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive into Rachel Aaron's 2K to 10K words,
Yes.
what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one right way to write.
Okay.
What works for one writer might not work for another, and
Well-
that's okay.
So it's about finding what works for you.
Exactly. Experiment, try new things. Don't be afraid to break the rule.
Right. And, most importantly,
Yes.
have fun.
Exactly, because at the end of the day,
Yeah,
writing should be enjoyable.
it should be.
And if it's not,
Yeah.
then what's the point?
That's a great place to end it, I think.
I think so too.
So until next time, happy writing, everyone.